If you've been watching this channel, you'll know that I've been working my way through Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, season by season, and doing reviews of each season as I go. Recently meaning 3 months ago, I reviewed Season 9, The Mexican Revolution, and in that review I mentioned that before listening to that podcast I knew very little about Pancho Villa, other than what I picked up from the Young Indiana Jones TV series many years ago. But after listening to Mike Duncan's podcast, I had a much fuller idea of the man and the very epic scope of his career. His career went through several phases and he was involved in a lot of stuff and had a very interesting life. Somebody by the name of Generic YouTuber mentioned in the comments to that video that if I was interested in learning more about Pancho Villa, there was a 2003 HBO movie which is freely available on YouTube. I don't think it's legally available on YouTube. I think somebody has uploaded this in violation of the copyright holders. But it's there at the moment. And so I mentioned that I would wait until the wife and kids were out of town before I had some time to myself to watch it. But wife and kids are at my wife's parents' this week, so I finally have some time to myself. And I watched it. This is, I'll link to it in the description down below. This is, as I mentioned before, it was made for HBO back in 2003. It's on YouTube at the moment. Now, who knows how long it's going to stay on YouTube until the copyright holders issue a takedown notice. It looks like it's been up there for a year. We'll see if it makes it to 2. But at least at the moment of recording, it is freely available on YouTube, so you can check it out yourself in the description down below. The movie is called and starring Pancho Villa as himself, and it's based on a film that was made of Pancho Villa and his exploits by an American film company in 1914. Now, I had known this film existed because of Mike Duncan's podcast. He talked briefly about this film. It surprised me a little bit because I thought, Pancho Villa was the enemy of America. Infamously, Pancho Villa invaded America in, I forget which year. But it turns out, and I learned this from Mike Duncan's podcast, that Pancho Villa had several ups and downs with the American government and the American public. And at one point, before Pancho Villa did his little invasion of America, he was, what's the word I want to look for? Respected, admired by some segments of American society who saw him as kind of a Mexican Robin Hood, a fighter for justice. This was of course before he did his little invasion of Texas. But there was an American film company who was interested in making a film, and they went down and it's an interesting story. They, again, I picked this up on Mike Duncan's podcast. They provided him with uniforms. They recreated some of the footage when they couldn't get the correct shots that they wanted, and they did a lot of interfering and recreating, but they made a movie about the life of Pancho Villa, which includes the real Pancho Villa himself and some actual battle footage. Now, unfortunately, this silent film is now lost. It's one of the many films that are lost from the silent film era. So you can't watch it now, but we do have accounts of what it was like. We do have reports of what it was like. And the subject of this 2003 HBO movie is recounting the story of the making of this film. It's an interesting choice for focus. So it's not a biographical movie about Pancho Villa, although Pancho Villa figures very heavily in it. But the main character of the movie is the character who's producing the film. A guy named Frank in Taylor, who is, I guess, the nephew of one of the heads of the studios, nephew of Harry Atkin. Yeah. The movie was very interesting. And it's a little bit unclear how much is fact and how much is fiction. I did my best to research this on Wikipedia after watching the movie. I didn't go further than Wikipedia. So if there's some other page on the web somewhere that I'm missing, somebody let me know. But the information on Wikipedia about this movie and about the historical event on which it's based on is a little bit thin at the moment. In 5 years, maybe that Wikipedia page will fill out. But at the moment I'm recording here, it's a little bit thin. Most of the people in the movie are real people, and from the Wikipedia webpage for this movie, you can click on their bios and see their real stories. Some of what you will find from clicking around in Wikipedia, or some of what I found, doesn't line up exactly with the movie. So, for example, Alan Arkin plays, Sam Drebin, who's a mercenary, American Jewish mercenary, who was in this movie fighting with Pancho Villa. He's got his own Wikipedia page. He looks like an interesting guy. In fact, clicking on that, he was known as the Fighting Jew. He fought in all kinds of wars and revolutions. But at least based on his Wikipedia page, it doesn't look like he was ever fighting with Pancho Villa directly. He was smuggling arms for Pancho Villa, but he wasn't actually. Doesn't look like he was actually fighting Pancho Villa's army, as is portrayed in this HBO movie. Also, in the HBO movie, the character, spoiler alert, by the way, the character loses his arm near the end of the movie and one of the battles, which doesn't appear to line up with his Wikipedia entry. In Wikipedia entry, it says that the only injury he ever got was in Guatemala when he had a shot in the rear. It doesn't say the date of that, but that was sometime before the Mexican Revolution, or his involvement in the Mexican Revolution. Now, as always, standard disclaimer, I'm not an expert on any of this. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia page. So if he actually did lose his arm and it's just not on the Wikipedia page, then I would stand to be corrected. I don't want this review to be just a list of everything I learned on Wikipedia. So without getting into everything, there are other differences here. It looks like they're at least taking some liberties with the history. But assuming that this is largely a true historical story, it's interesting. I found it very interesting while I was watching it. It was not, however, enthralling. I wasn't wowed by it. And I think that's because this is a problem with, I guess, a lot of historical movies or history biops. The plot arcs were not as classic or not as evident as they would have been in a more traditional story. So Frank in Taylor is the main character. He's the nephew of the studio executive who's there to film Pancho Villa. But, Pancho Villa is really the character who dominates the movie. Now, Pancho Villa doesn't really have much of an arc. He finishes the movie as pretty much the same character as he started it off. He doesn't change or grow. Frank, I guess, changes and grows in the sense that he changes his evaluation of Pancho Villa throughout the movie, but it's a little bit, it's a little bit unclear, and there seem to be some arcs which are hinted at but not really fully developed. So, for example, there's Frank and Taylor, the main character, has a romance with Teddy Sampson, who, again, is a real person with a real Wikipedia page. Now, it's unclear from Wikipedia whether or not this romance between her and Frank and Taylor ever happened, or this is another invention of the movie. My suspicion is it's an invention of the movie, but I don't know. But she's a Hollywood star. He's smitten with her. Later, when she comes down to Mexico, and again, according to her Wikipedia bio, she really was involved in this movie, The Life of Sancho Villa. They strike up a romance for no real reason. And then seems to end for no real reason. And then, at the end, she's being shown with another, somebody else who's higher up in the movie system. And he makes some sort of sarcastic comment to her, like, onwards and upwards. So it's interesting. But it's not really hooking, that kind of thing. It doesn't really... It's mildly interesting, but it doesn't have like the huge dramatical payoff or the emotional payoff. And a lot of the bits and pieces in this movie are like that. Interesting, but not completely enthralling. There are some good battle scenes in this movie, considering it was a made-for-TV movie. They must have spent a lot of money on it. So it seems to be well done from a technical perspective. But in terms of like a real hook on the story arc, it didn't feel like that. I mean, I guess the story arc is they're making this movie about Pancho Villa, but I didn't really ever feel like there was any tension about would they make the movie or wouldn't they. It's just they're shooting a bunch of footage, at the end of which they put this footage together in a movie. The movie gets well received. So interesting, but not enthralling. An impressive cast for this movie, considering it was a made-for-TV movie. Although it's HBO, isn't it? But Antonio Banderas plays Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa, as much as what I picked up on him from Mike Duncan's podcast, again, I'm no expert. I've only listened to the podcast, but what I got from Mike Duncan is that he was a genuine fighter for the lower classes. And he really wanted to be seen as a Mexican Robin Hood and a fighter for justice. It's a little bit unclear, as it is unclear with all historical figures, how much of this is genuine idealism and how much of this is egotism, him wanting to portray himself in this role. So I'm putting on the airs of an expert, aren't I? All I know is what I heard from Mike Duncan's podcast. This is just the impression I got. But at any rate, he did want to fulfill that role, fighting for justice in the Mexican Revolution. However, as Mike Duncan also makes clear in his podcast, he had a vindictive and murderous personality. Sorry, vindictive is the wrong word. As portrayed in Mike Duncan's podcast, he could get into these murderous rages sometimes, when he'd get angry and he'd just kill people on whims. And so that has to be balanced against the work for social justice that he did. That that portrayal of Pancho Villa that I got from Mike Duncan's podcast is very much in this HBO movie as well. He wants to be on the side of social justice, but it does show how he could get angry and then people would die. So again, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to make myself an expert on Pancho Villa, but the impression I got from Mike Duncan's podcast lined up with the portrayal I saw in this movie. Alan Arkin played Sam Drebin, the Jewish mercenary who I mentioned before. But there are other people in here. Kyle Chandler plays Raoul Walsh, who, if you look in his Wikipedia page, he actually was a very influential movie person and director. But at this stage in his career, he was playing the young Pancho Villa, which again, the real Raoul Walsh did. And then there's a whole bunch of people in this movie who looked really familiar to me. I'm sure I've seen them in a lot of different things, but I couldn't place them. And I mean, their bios are all on Wikipedia here. I see their names in front of me, but I don't recognize these names. But definitely people I've seen before and different things. John Reed is portrayed in this movie. Again, I'm not sure how historical this is. I mean, how involved was John Reed in the production of this movie? The movie meaning the life of Pancho Villa. John Reed is the famous socialist newspaper person who's I think most famous nowadays for being in Warren Beatty's 1981, right? Movie Reds, which I saw long ago and I'm due to see again. Mike Duncan has mentioned John Reed as well in his podcast. Again, I'm not sure how historical this is having John Reed in the story, but it was interesting to see him in the movie, the historical figure John Reed. I think I'll just finish up here before I just start rambling about random stuff. The bottom line is it was an interesting movie. It wasn't enthralling because I'm not sure it had any great plot arcs or character arcs. But then that's often the case when you're doing a movie based on history, because history is a little bit messy like that. Although it does seem like they deviated from the actual history in several instances, but the information on Wikipedia is a little bit scant, and I'm no expert, so I'm not able to give a full report on what the real history would have been. But the movie's worth checking out if you have some free time. Again, I'll leave a link to it in the description down below for however long it stays on YouTube.